Thanks so much for the opportunity to contribute to this seminar series. My task today for the Columbia River Basin is to answer three key questions. First, do hatcheries help or hurt the recovery of wild runs? Second, is fishing having a substantial effect, positive or negative, on the recovery of wild runs? And third, perhaps the most politically charged, are hatcheries and big wild runs mutually exclusive? Your task today is decide how much of what you hear is applicable elsewhere. But first, a bit of essential context. For millennia, the range of these species has been the North Pacific and surrounding basins. As climate changed, and it did many times, the distribution expanded and shrunk, especially at the southern ends. That is, on the eastern side, modern-day California, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, and on the western side, China, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan. However, currently, Pacific salmon are also found in New Zealand, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Falkland Islands, the North American Great Lakes, the U.S., Canadian, and Russian Arctic Ocean, Iceland, Scotland, Norway, Sweden, northwestern Russia, and who knows where pink salmon have turned up this month. Most definitely, Pacific salmon are a resilient, highly adaptable species. But from here on, I'm only going to focus on a single North Pacific location, the Columbia River Basin. Also, when I say salmon, I include steelhead. Although it is only a single river basin, it covers an Alberta-sized slice of real estate. Standing in the U.S., looking north, across the 49th parallel, perhaps the BC portion appears small. These days, even inconsequential from a salmon perspective, but it is not. The Canadian portion is only 15% of the basin's land area, but it stores more than a third of the snowpack. And several mammoth Canadian dams serve as gigantic storage containers, as well as producing substantial amounts of electricity. Further, it is the 4 Canadian Columbia River dams that allow for the full power generation year-round from the U.S. portion of the main stem Columbia, rather than being limited to historically high runoff months. So much for the 1-minute hydrology lesson. Now for a synopsis of the human footprint in the basin. For humans, the basin's indigenous population peaked around 1500, perhaps at 1 million, but then began a steep decline, largely caused by old world diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, and eventually dropping by about 90%. So, by the early 1800s, the human population, being almost entirely indigenous, was very low. Thus, the effect of humans on salmon abundance was certainly not zero, but it was not dominant. Things changed in the mid-1800s. Today, the basin's human population is around 5 million and heading to more than 10 million by the end of this century. Moving to salmon, estimates vary of the pre-1850 aggregate basin salmon run, but nearly all fall between 5 and 15 million. More recent work puts the number towards the lower end, perhaps 6 or 7 million. Sure, there were big, disruptive natural events such as the massive collapse of Table Mountain in the 1400s, just upriver from Portland, creating a 170-mile, 300-foot-deep lake, completely blocking the mid and upper Columbia to migrating salmon for more than a decade or two. Think about that. No salmon reaching the mid and upper Columbia for decades. What a demonstration of resilience. But since the 1800s, ignorance is not a credible excuse for what happened. For example, in the 1860s, with the adoption of modern cannon technology, concurrent with the proliferation of railroads, commercial fishing shifted to high gear, and that was just a start. By the 1890s, well over a century ago, the head of what is now the U.S. National Marine Fisheries Service pleaded for something to be done to restore the dramatically depleted salmon runs. Roughly a 75% reduction overall, well before any main-stem dams. One well-known example of societal policy trade-offs, choices, in the 1930s and 1940s, a sequential suite of salmon policy drivers burst on the scene. Initially, the responses to the Depression, followed by preparations for a likely war, and then the Second World War itself. There were many other trade-offs to be sure, but people realized that the choices that were made would not be good for salmon. A bit of caution here. Even with solid data, and anyone who has ever evaluated run data knows, this graph is way too textbook perfect. But what is apparent is the general long-term pattern. But even that long-term pattern is often disrupted by the so-called good and bad ocean conditions. The familiar Pacific decadal oscillations and similar phenomena are somewhat appreciated, but also there are variations in terrestrial climate that also affect salmon abundance. However, overall, the 173-year downward trend is unmistakable, and it continues. Okay, that was the past. Now for the rest of this talk, I will focus on the most likely future of the basin salmon, in particular, the future of wild salmon. But first, let's acknowledge a few facts. One obvious reality, nowadays there are few wild salmon returning to the Columbia. Why? Well, over 40% of the basin that once supported wild salmon no longer does, mostly due to dams. And much of the remaining basin is highly altered. Second, of the current total basin run, that is both wild and hatchery, about 4 in 5 started life in a hatchery. Third, over the past 40 years, roughly $9 billion has been spent by U.S. federal and state governments in efforts to sustain, much less recover, the runs. If the foregone revenue and opportunity costs are included, the total expenditure leaps to an even bigger number. And fourth, yeah, sure, everyone cheerleads reversing the downward trend in the basin, but enthusiasm drops off when realistic policy trade-offs are explained, and monetary and non-monetary costs are included. For example, consider the consequences for wild salmon of the additional 5 to 10 million basin residents by 2100, as well as the 30 to 40 million more people calling the Pacific Northwest home. As for selecting an overarching salmon recovery strategy for the basin, some argue that hatcheries are just about the worst option. Conversely, others believe that the little remaining salmon fishing would not be possible without the annual stocking of more than 140 million smolts pumped out of the basin's 208 hatcheries. Second, regarding commercial recreational, and tribal fishing, various advocates assert that continued harvesting of hatchery salmon keeps wild salmon numbers low. Stop all fishing, they argue, and wild abundance would rebound. Is that true? Third, how much good have the billions of dollars spent actually done for wild salmon, other than employ thousands of people like me and some of you to fatten up at the public trough? Sorry, an awkward question, most definitely. Okay, what type of information is required to answer these fundamental policy relevant questions? My first choice is what is commonly regarded as science, the process of testing hypotheses in a rational, systematic, testable, and reproducible manner. You need all four for the scientific method. But to be amenable to the scientific method, the research questions, the hypotheses, are necessarily simplified. Alternatively, experiential knowledge is ubiquitous in fisheries management and policy, and it can address complex research questions, but it does not meet the four rigorous requirements of the scientific method. However, what about scientific experts who use a blend of science and personal experiential knowledge and thus, arguably, provide the most credible answers to complex policy and management questions? But a cautionary note, what about employment or personal policy bias? Once you cajole scientific experts into participating, their answers presented in public are often very different than their answers offered in private. In my experience, anonymity is essential. Given all this, how can the most credible and most policy relevant answers be obtained? My answer was to perform a simple thought experiment, one with promised anonymity for all participants. First, I created a long list of senior scientists who had extensive research and management experience with the basin's salmon issues. All were what any of us would classify as a who's who of scientific experts. Second, right from the very first contact, I promised complete anonymity. Interestingly, from the start, many participants expressed appreciation for being able to answer questions bluntly and candidly, free of pressure from employers, colleagues, or advocacy organizations. Third, the questions were strictly science or fact-based. I did not push any particular policy goal or management approach, nor did I ever ask participants for their views about which policy goal or approach should be adopted. First, from an initial list of 100 experts, I was able to find email information for 96. Standard email requests were sent to those 96. Second, 67 responded to the first or second email. As survey goes, this is a very high response rate. Third, 60 of the 67 agreed to participate. Of the 7 who declined, 2 did so, paraphrasing, the likely result will be used by opposing advocates to undermine our preferred policy position. The reality, this is a highly charged political issue, and science is often an effective advocacy weapon in such disputes. Fourth, ultimately 58 of the 60 answered the question. Their actual responses are posted at my Oregon State University website. Okay, what question exactly was asked? This is the question asked of all participants. In essence, all of a sudden, assume no hatcheries and no fishing. What would happen to the Columbia River Basin's wild salmon. To allow time for the runs to adjust to this new reality, that is, no fishing and no hatcheries, I asked respondents to allow for a couple of decades for the runs to adjust. Many respondents provided a single sentence answer with little, if any, elaboration. Others provided pages of detailed explanation justifying each step in the thought process. Well, the bottom line. What do experts think would happen to the abundance of wild salmon in the Columbia River Basin without hatcheries and no fishing? Think for a second. What would your answer be? First off, more than 4 in 5 respondents, 83%, predicted that current total salmon abundance, that is, both hatchery and wild, would decline. Many of the 83% expected the resulting total run, which would be only wild, to sink to a much, much lower number, some to even less than the already low, very low, current wild run. No one predicted complete extirpation of salmon from the basin, but most expected that the current total run, a couple of decades after closing hatcheries and stopping fishing, would decline greatly. Presumably, so much so that little or no sustainable harvest would be feasible. Examining the alternative possible outcome, only 1 in 20 predicted that wild runs overall would be higher than the current total run. So what is the take-home policy message? Here's the bottom line for managers, policymakers, politicians, and the public. According to the experts, eliminating all salmon and steelhead fishing and closing all basin fish hatcheries would not greatly change the abundance of the basin's wild salmon and steelhead. Of course, hatchery runs would go to zero. Essentially, 20 years after stopping fishing and closing hatcheries, there would most likely be many fewer total salmon, but roughly the same number of wild salmon as now. Yeah, some expected perhaps a tad more, but most respondents predicted the same or fewer, or a lot fewer, wild salmon. The key point, almost every respondent predicted that after 20 years, there would be a smaller total run in the basin than today, a drop from about 1 to 2 million total salmon to probably 200 to 300,000 wild salmon, about 3 to 5% of the 1850s abundance. ESA levels, not fishable runs. So what are the implications? First, right off the top, the current fishable salmon runs in the basin are largely sustained by hatchery releases. Essentially, no hatcheries, no fishing. Second, implicit in the results, hatcheries don't seem to have much effect on the abundance of wild runs, except to provide a lot of strays that end up spawning. Third, even success in ESA delisting will not likely mean that there are fishable runs. Wild runs less than 5% of historical levels are generally not fishable on a sustained basis. And fourth, without the pre-1850 climate and the unaltered conditions in the basin, big runs of wild salmon are not realistic. Okay, an anonymous survey of experts is one approach, but are there other ways to answer such questions? Let me dramatically shift gears here and present a very different approach. The effectiveness of the basin's massive salmon recovery efforts can be assessed by computing society's return on investment. Recovery programs are expensive, and the nagging unknown is always, how effective were those expenditures in increasing or even sustaining wild or hatchery runs? Good question, but how to answer? To start, we have 4 decades of pretty good Columbia River run data. It's not perfect, but it's quite good as fisheries data go. Further, we also have a pretty good estimate of the dollar cost of salmon recovery programs over the past 40 years. Okay, the crucial policy question is, what did the public get for all this restoration money? Yes, a lot of money was spent over the years, and one oft-stated purpose was to recover wild salmon. Did it? As luck would have it, one of my Oregon State University colleagues, an economist, Bill Jager, and a USGS biologist just published an analysis. Here is a synopsis, hot off the press. First, $9 billion has been spent directly by governments to restore salmon in the basin. And of course, this direct expenditure is conservative because it does not include the so-called foregone revenue and opportunity costs. Their overall conclusion, after 40 years of restoration efforts, there were no net benefits from such expenditures. In other words, spending $9 billion made no measurable difference in salmon runs. Zero. Not what anyone wants to hear, right? More directly relevant to the topic today, they also concluded that the restoration programs relative to wild salmon failed miserably. Thus, their results are broadly consistent with my survey. Perhaps recovery programs did benefit salmon on a local scale, but there is no overall measurable improvement despite spending billions. Astonishingly, when these facts seem so apparent, how has this sobering reality persisted for at least 4 decades? To answer, let me hypothesize. Let me speculate. Think back to when you sat in the back row of Political Science 101. Never short of answers, political scientists will readily offer 2 likely and familiar reasons for this apparent illusion. First, policy domestication. It is ever so tempting for politicians to neutralize, to domesticate a nasty political conflict by inundating it with heaps of money. After all, your friendly, ever-responsive government is spending billions to fund the salmon recovery industry. Essentially, the political proposition is, let's not do anything unpopular until the experts do what they can do with all this money. Yes, tried and true symbolic politics. Second, in that same political science class, if you were still listening, you might have heard something about policy advocates masquerading as scientists. Yes, a portion of the scientific information that the government officials, politicians, and most importantly, the public actually hear is provided by such folks. Those who cloak themselves in the accoutrements of science, but actually offer nothing but policy advocacy masquerading as science. But there's a third component to the answer, ecological reality. One key ecological reality, often overlooked, many of the basin's fish species are doing extremely well. For example, the most abundant anatomous fish in the basin these days is not a species of salmon or steelhead, but American shad, an introduced species that is very abundant. Similarly, walleye, smallmouth bass, northern pike, and many others provide world-class fishing opportunities, but not salmon or steelhead. Yes, good old biology 101. an unsurprising change given the highly altered state of the basin, coupled with a different climate 200 years ago. Let me wrap up with a few take-home messages. First, the decline of wild salmon should not be much of a surprise. After all, the main policy drivers are broadly known. Second, to change any of these policy drivers requires substantial economic and lifestyle changes from the residents of the region. Engineering and other tweaks will not do it. Third, perhaps it is time to engage the public and politicians in a serious discussion about whether the billions being spent to recreate substantial wild runs has any prospect of success. I'll close by shifting from hard-nosed analysis to empathetic opinion. Beginning with a very big piece of real estate, the Columbia River Basin, some 200 plus years ago, David Thompson, David Douglas, Meriwether Lewis, and William Clark described its salmon runs to the world. And yes, I know their time was very different, including the weather. For example, near present-day Portland, 2 centuries ago, in some years, even the great Columbia River itself was ice-covered. Wagons could be driven across the entire width for weeks on end. And there were curling matches on the river near present-day Portland. Indeed, it must have been a great time to be a salmon. Beyond changing climate, what played out over the ensuing 2 centuries for salmon should not be surprising. And it was broadly predictable. People sought a better life for their families. They needed to eat. They detested floods. They demanded that wars be won. They voted for candidates that promised cheap, reliable electricity, and much, much more. Old news for sure. And there is nothing wrong or right about those policy choices. For those of us who make our living in the salmon recovery industry, perhaps it is past time to ditch our comforting illusions. As well, it is surely past time to banish groundless optimism and, equally important, to avoid deceptive pessimism. Indeed, it is time for blunt, accurate appraisals about the future of the basin's wild salmon and steelhead runs. Nothing more and nothing less is warranted. Thank you.